In this video, we're going to be covering the healers, ranking each of them for the Vault of the Incarnate's Raid in Shadowlands. Like always, we're rating them based on their performance, their utility, and of course, how strong their cooldowns are. Just as a disclaimer, it's worth mentioning that this list is not set in stone. Balance tuning is an ever-consistent thing that just happens with this game, so, they could put out a patch tomorrow and make everything totally different. And one last thing, I want to say that even if a spec is not doing very well, in the hands of a good player, or just someone that really enjoys that spec and has a lot of time on it, they can do really well with it. So don't be discouraged if your main isn't doing too well, because it's worth mentioning that unless you're in a cutting edge or just a really high-end guild, these tier lists really shouldn't make that big of a difference. If you're more of a casual player, or you're someone that's just, doing normal or heroic, then these tier lists are not going to be that big of a deal. You guys can play any of these specs in heroic and just do totally fine. So with that out of the way, let's get into the rankings. So S tier is for specs that are just doing incredibly well. They have really good toolkits, and they're just overall really solid picks. A tier are for specs that are just solid choices, and honestly, you just really can't go wrong with one of these guys. B are for specs that are doing pretty good, but they may not have quite as many things as A might have. C are for specs which are noticeably weaker than the other specs, and they may lack in heals or damage, or they just might not have as strong cooldowns as someone in A or B. And then D are for specs that I think have issues and or need some strong buffs or tweaks to their talent trees. Now that we've gone over all the tier lists, let's begin. For the S tier, we have nothing. I don't think there's currently any insanely OP healing specs at the moment. I think they're all kind of relatively balanced. So now let's move on to the A tier, and starting off we have the Holy Paladin. With a surprise to nobody, Holy Paladins are once again at the top of the healers for the raid, as they usually always are. This time is no different. Holy Paladins have some of the best cooldowns in the game with things like Aura Mastery and Devotion Aura, which both provide some incredible damage reduction for the raid. They are outstanding tank healers with things like Beacon of Light. Their playstyle provides them with some strong single target healing. They come with some really good personal defensives, some of which are just straight up immunities, a number of really strong external defensives like Blessing of Sacrifice and Blessing of Protection, and on top of that, Holy does some actually decent damage too, which is not to be ignored. Next up we have the Discipline Priest. It shouldn't be a shock to see Disc up here, just like Holy Paladins. Disc is just another one of those healers which just excel and seem to be just built for raiding. There are two reasons why Disc is just really good right now. The first of which is that they just have incredibly great healing for the raid after they've received a ton of burst damage, thanks to things like Evangelism, where they'll just pop Atonement on the raid and just start spamming their damage rotation and just slowly help the raid recover. Then the next reason is that Disc currently does the most damage out of any healer in the game, and on top of that, Disc also provides power infusion. And then if they take the talent Twins of the Sun Priestess, when they cast PI on another player, they'll actually get a part of that buff too. So having a spec where they do good raid healing, but also really good damage and provide PI is why Disc is in the A tier. Preservation Evokers are currently doing really high damage and healing. While I don't think that the damage that they do is better than Disc Priest at the moment, I still think they're in a really good spot. Preservation has some really strong cooldowns with things like Rewind. They're also incredibly mobile, and they can move out of mechanics really easy. And with things like Hover, they can cast spells while they move too, which is always nice. Despite all that, the only downfall that I can think of with Evokers is that they need to be kind of in range to put out some of their healing. But I think with how some of the fights are, a lot of these different fights for the bosses require the group to be stacked pretty tightly, so right now, I think at least with this raid, it's not that big of an issue, but it might be something to think about down the road. Now we move on to the B tier, where we have the Restoration Druid. Resto is very similar to Disc in the sense that they have some really strong AoE healing and provide some really great utility. Now, before you guys get your pitchforks out, what I mean by that is that I think Resto Druids do better AoE healing than Disc, but I think they both kind of serve the same niche as far as healing goes. And just like Preservation Evokers, Resto Druids are incredibly mobile too. And the nice thing about Resto Druids is that a lot of their abilities are instant casts, so they can just, cast while they're moving so effortlessly, and it's just a really nice thing to have. They also have some really strong healing cooldowns with things like Tranquility and Flourish, which both put out a ton of AoE healing. Druids also come with Mark of the Wild, which is always great to have, and they can put out some decent damage, but I will say that it's not as good as, let's say, Holy or Preservation Invokers, but it's still pretty good to have. Mistweavers have received a ton of buffs recently, and it's put them into the position that I think they're shaping up to be a really solid raid healer. They do have some pretty good passive damage, they provide some solid throughput healing, and they have some of the strongest healing cooldowns in the game with things like Invoke Yulon the Jade Serpent. But at the moment, they just don't seem to be as good as the other specs in the A tier, and one of the biggest downfalls to Mistweaver is that they still have mana issues. However, I will say that the new improved Fist Weaving for Mistweavers is incredibly fun to play, and if you guys don't have a Windwalker or Brewmaster in your raid, then having a Mistweaver is not bad because you get that Mystic Touch, which is going to provide a little bit extra damage for your melee. Holy Priests are one of the best healers in the game when it comes to reacting to damage coming out. Their whole toolkit is literally built for that. So if you're someone who doesn't like to play a healer that is, basically having to predict damage but rather react to it, then Holy is a decent choice. Like Disc, Holy can provide power infusion to your raid and fortitude. Holy has some decent cooldowns too, with things like Symbol of Hope and Divine Hymn. And I would argue that if you're someone who plays Holy, and you also have the ability to play Disc pretty well, that would make you an incredibly valuable healer to have in any raid. So now let's drop down to C, where we have our last healer, the Resto Shaman. And unfortunately, Resto Shamans are just not doing as well as the other specs, and I would argue that they're probably the weakest as far as healing and damage goes out of any of the other healers in the game. However, I will say that they do have some really strong cooldowns with things like Spirit Link Totem, and they're also very mobile, and having Bloodlust is also just really nice to have. So with that, that will be the end of our healer tier list for Vault of the Incarnates. Let me know in the comments which healing spec you guys are currently playing and which ones you guys think are doing really good, or, which ones are bad, or, if you guys think I made a mistake or anything like that, just let me know in the comments. I'd love hearing from you guys. And thank you so much for checking out my content. And with that, we'll see you guys in the next one.